some of them have had promises before, you know, from Minister McEntee, from previous ministers over the last 4 or 5 years. There's been huge talk of zero tolerance and an impression given beyond the reality about what's actually been done by the previous government. The reality is that we now have a situation whereby, 6 women have been killed in 8 weeks in this country. I see yesterday figures came out of a huge increase, up to 65,000 reports to Gardaí of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, a massive rise on 2020, incredible increase. And I think it shows that more and more women are going to report. They're not going to tolerate sexual and gender-based violence, but also they want a response. So the things that we're calling for, the counselling notes, has got a huge coverage heretofore. And what we're being told or behind the scenes is that, oh, well, maybe it's unconstitutional to ban these misogynistic practices. And I have to say, Eamon de Valera was hardly sitting down in 1938 drafting up Article 38.1 about the right to a fair trial with therapy notes in mind. You know, the idea that these are necessary for anybody's defence when they're only really used to try to find something to undermine a complainant. And of course, character references, again, I've been contacted by somebody who had 35 character references used. Yesterday we saw the same thing. Somebody, a victim of a brutal assault by somebody 50 years older than them over a period of years, 7 references lined up. This practice has to stop. But also we want investment in the courts, and we want real action to stop rape myths, and investment so that people actually have their cases heard in a timely way rather than being re-traumatised. So there's some of the things that we'll be demanding are acted upon, and we'll have a number of survivors here hoping for that this signals real change on this issue. The other issue I want to mention is, of course, that we will be bringing into the Dáil yet again the idea that the Taoiseach shouldn't go on St. Patrick's Day. We've seen more, ravings from Donald Trump as he met Macron yesterday. It's welcome that Sinn Féin have said they're not going, but Sinn Féin should have called on the Taoiseach not to go as well. Their position doesn't make sense. Like you're saying the Taoiseach should have less of a moral compass than the opposition. You know, by that logic as well, Michelle O'Neill should go because she's the leader of the Northern Ireland. So we want no politicians to go representing Ireland with somebody and basically normalising ethnic cleansing, normalising genocide and normalising his assault on people within the US as well. So if you want to say about the housing issue or...
Just a few things.
Yeah. I mean, obviously housing remains a massive crisis that the government is failing to act upon, and I think the Housing Commission's report is further example of that there is absolutely no alternative now but for the state to really play the lead role in this, to make it an emergency and to invest in public housing as an absolute burning priority. I've mentioned before we've got land banks in Dublin West. We have people in terrible suffering. Those land banks are sitting idle, not a priority of the local authority. Why isn't the Dáil doing something about that? So that's what we will be pushing for.
Thanks. Okay, just following on from that point, for 8 months we've been chasing the government to have a open and meaningful discussion about the Housing Commission report, which highlighted in May of last year that the government's housing targets were completely inadequate to address the absolutely catastrophic housing situation in this country, and that there needed to be a radical reset in housing policy. The government ran away from that debate, and we now know why they ran away from that debate, because they deceived the public, they tricked them during the election about what was actually happening with the housing crisis, and now we have a poll at the weekend which shows very significant numbers of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael voters would have voted differently if they had have known the truth, which the government wasn't willing to admit, about what was actually happening with housing. So we have a catastrophic situation where the government lied to the public in advance of the election and tricked them as to what was happening with the most important issue facing this country, a catastrophic housing and homelessness crisis. And their unwillingness to be fully scrutinised about this continues this week, because every week for 8 months we demanded that they would have a discussion on the Housing Commission. They were finally forced by a robust opposition to have a debate this week, but then they refused a request to have the Minister answering questions in that debate. So there'll be statements, but no questions. So the government do not want to be scrutinised about the detail of what is going on with the housing crisis. When we hear news, for example, this week, the planning permissions are down, that rents are up, the housing crisis is continuing to escalate out of control, and the government is trying to minimise the ability of the opposition to actually interrogate them about this most disastrous of crises. And that leads directly into the point about what's at stake at the Dáil Reform Committee and the whole question of the Lowry and Healy-Rae groups being designated in a special designation where they will eat into the speaking time of the opposition, potentially get committee positions that would otherwise go to the opposition, and further give a government that already has a majority in all committees, controls the majority of Dáil speaking time, gets the majority of speaking time in every debate. They want to give the government a super majority by having this new designation to allow them to take leaders' questions and ease into the opposition's time and resources across the Dáil. So we will be, along with all the opposition groups, we will be very, very robustly resisting this undemocratic move to sabotage democracy and the role of the opposition to hold the government to account over critical issues like housing, like special needs and disability, like gender-based violence, and all the important issues that matter to people. The government are trying to actually sabotage and undermine the opposition. And just one thing that hasn't been highlighted enough, in my opinion, that shows the lie really that the government are, their actions are motivated by a desire to give government backbenchers. This is one of the lines they've been spinning. If they're so concerned about giving speaking time to their own backbenchers, why then, in their submission last week, are they proposing to reduce Taoiseach's questions, which up until now happens twice a week, and where government backbenchers have the right to ask questions to Taoiseach? Their submission is proposing to reduce it to once a week. So they're actually proposing to further reduce the ability of their own backbenchers and the opposition to ask the Taoiseach's questions. So there's a very systematic move by the government to reduce its exposure to questioning by the opposition and by their own backbenchers. And all of this has been done to give special status to the Lowry Healy-Rae group who are propping up the government. It is absolutely outrageous. Last point I just want to briefly make is the announcement that the memo and the new Defence Amendment number 2 bill is going to go to Cabinet, and it's clear the government intends to ram this through, which is about undermining Ireland's neutrality by removing the triple lock. Once again, as with so many other things, the government are misleading the public, claiming that the triple lock is giving some sort of veto to the UN permanent members of the UN Security Council. Not true. Not true. There is no veto. We have every right to decide our own defence arrangements, but what the triple lock does do is prevent the UN making deployments where there's not agreement between belligerent powers that are shaping up against each other with the potential for conflict, right? And that's what neutrality is about. It is about not aligning with big powers, whether they're the US, Britain, or China or Russia. What neutrality means is we do not align with these big imperial powers who are shaping up to each other in a very, very dangerous way. People may have heard on the radio this morning, some US politician was talking about, well, the reason we want peace in Ukraine, and we all want peace in Ukraine, is because we need to pivot to the Pacific and to China, right? So this is what's going on. Europe and Trump all want to ramp up military expenditure in Europe. The Irish government want to drag us into this process of militarisation. And all of these big powers are just moving for their own cynical strategic advantage. And what we're saying is Ireland should not get dragged into this big power imperialist politics. We shouldn't be increasing expenditure on military when that money needs to go into things like housing, into addressing the cost of living, into the many, many issues that affect ordinary people in this country. So we are going to very, very robustly resist what is now clearly an imminent threat by the government to fundamentally attack and undermine Ireland's neutrality by removing the triple lock.
Ruth, just on the visit to DC by the Taoiseach, does President Macron's meeting with President Trump yesterday not show the importance of being in the room where you can call him out in real time, back check him in real time, rather than just sitting here on your laurels doing absolutely nothing and not raising the Irish people's views on things?
Well, obviously none of us thinks we should sit in our laurels and do nothing. We need a very strong statement from our Taoiseach about what President Trump has proposed for Gaza, which we haven't had. So if we haven't had it now, I doubt we'll have it sitting in the White House with them, to be frank. I wouldn't have too much faith in Micheál Martin standing up to Donald Trump publicly either, because we haven't seen any evidence of that. A little bit different for a big major imperial power like. And don't forget, Macron was very active in the genocide on Gaza too. So these are two imperial powers. He's shaping up because Europe and the US are now going to become more, hostile to each other economically and militarily.
Taoiseach also said this morning on his way into Cabinet that he would absolutely invite President Trump to visit Ireland. Do you think he should be invited here? Do you think he'd be welcome?
Well, I can see the protest marches gathering about that. I mean, we've had regular protests on the issue, particularly of Palestine. I think there's a very strong anti-imperialist mood in Ireland, and I think if Trump came, there'd be a huge response in opposition to that.
Richard, just on the standing orders issue, we're going to robustly resist whatever the government are putting through. What does that look like for your party?
Well, look, first of all, we'll be holding the government to the commitment that we wrung out of them during the nomination of the Taoiseach process, where Hildegard Naughton, at the time the whip, made a public declaration to the effect that no solution would be imposed that wasn't agreeable to the government in opposition. That was a solemn commitment made to the Dáil and to the Irish public. We expect them to hold to that. So the onus is on them. I know from a media point of view, everybody's looking forward to massive disruption, and the government are trying to play that up and talk about the outrageous scenes. There was nothing outrageous about the government, the opposition opposing a stroke by the government to allow the Lowry and Healy-Rae groups, who are part of the government, to pretend they're also part of the opposition. So we're going to be robustly resisting that and asking the government to honour the commitment not to ram it through and indeed to respect democracy. So the onus is on them, and we'll see what happens after that. But the opposition are very united in saying we are going to do absolutely everything to resist what is a fundamental undermining of democracy and the role of the Oireachtas to hold the government to account. This isn't about, just some obscure speaking issue. This is about the ability of the opposition to hold the government to account on behalf of the public on serious issues like housing, like health, where we know the government haven't been great at telling the truth to the public.
And can I just say on that, the government are a laughingstock over this. Everywhere you go, you go to the checkout, the person at the checkout comments on this, your mechanic, everybody knows what's going on here and sees through it, and it's actually laughable that the government is maintaining this pretense, because it's been laughed at by the general public.
Richard, would you urge other political parties in the opposition to remove any pairing arrangements with the government over this issue?
Well, People Before Profit has never done pairing arrangements with the government. We don't believe in facilitating the government. So yes, I think that would be a good move. And I think the opposition need to do absolutely everything. I'm glad that we've had a united opposition on this, and I think we need to maintain that. And I think the public are very glad that the opposition have united to resist this attempt to undermine democracy. And people see it for what it is. And I would ask you also, if the government continue to spin this nonsense about government backbenchers, to just check the facts on this. The government control the vast, vast majority of speaking time in the Dáil. They control the Dáil schedule. They have a majority on all committees. And at the same time that they're whinging about backbenchers not having enough time, they're removing Taoiseach's questions for 1 day a week, to reduce it to 1 day a week from 2, in a way that will actually undermine their own ability of their own backbenchers to question the Taoiseach. So this is a stroke, and it has been covered with untruths about what actually happens in the Dáil.
And the unaligned group have voted with the government on every single vote since the Dáil started, by the way. So.
Can I ask you this question, moving back to the trials and issue of violence against women? You're talking about character references. Is there any scope for some other mechanism to use? Take, for example, both Richard and I were convicted, and Richard had 345 convictions and I had none. That the judge would want to take some of that into account. Is there another way of assisting the judiciary to do that and incorporate that into a final verdict, or is it something that you believe should just be restricted to the evidence as presented to the court?
Well, your defence lawyer is going to say that to the judge, so you don't need somebody. The problem with the character references is threefold. Number one, it's completely unreliable. Nobody knows, the person working in the gym or the GAA club does not know what you are like in private, behind closed doors, in a gender-based violence relationship. Actually, men who commit such violence tend to cultivate a persona where they're the world's most popular people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's extremely traumatising for the victim. And, it's just, the person has already been found guilty. It's the last thing that happens in the trial, There's no need for these character references. The defence team can make the kind of points that you spoke about, but they really don't work in these cases. And people think they're experts on people's character, and we're not. We don't know what people are like in those very intimate, crimes. That's the